In Unit 6, we're going to look at intents and specifically implicit intents, which let us connect to third-party apps, other apps that are out there to get functionality. That's one of the features of the Android um, development process is to not do everything within your app, but use other apps for certain resources. Lets you develop things relatively quickly. We're going to use some of the resources from Android, in particular is interacting with other apps and a couple of these other things. Um, so this training module talks about this. Um, in Android, every screen is called an activity. We've been just using apps with a single activity, and next week, in the next unit, we'll look at apps with multiple screens, and they'll have multiple activities, and we'll use this same sort of intent, these intents to go from one of our activities to another. But this unit, we're gonna look at working with other apps that are already defined. So there's a couple lessons here that are pretty good. This first one, sending a user to another app, we'll walk through that. It's a good little, well, I don't know if it's good. There's a video here that's kind of entertaining. Talks about doing some air checking, which I'll mention in just a little sec here. But to do this, what we do is we build an intent with some information, and one of the important part is where we want some data about where we're going to go, and this is generally stored in a URI. I don't know if you've heard of URIs before. They are a more generic version of URLs. So you're used to URLs, these HTTP colon things. URI is a generic version of that. So rather than just having HTTP or HTTPS colon slash slash, there'll be things like telephone colon and things like that. So we set up a a URI, define a variable of that type, give it some name, and we usually use this URI.parse to convert some string into a URI. Once we have that, we call the intent. We say new intent. There's some action, and we'll talk about what some of these are. So to dial the phone, the intent action is called action.dial. So in the intent class, there's a number of enumerated types here that are built in. So you specify one of those, and then you specify your URI with the data that you want to send to that other app. So you create this intent, and then we'll start that activity here. Um, and so later on, we'll call this start activity down here. But a couple other things. So there's different kinds of intents. So this is if we're phoning someone. If we want to display something on a map, again, we create a URI with maybe the address of the map of where we're going or the latitude and longitude of where we're going. Um, Set that up here, and then we will specify, we'll start a new intent. And so now rather than action dial, we'll have action view, and then we specify again the URI that we're going to do. That's our map intent. If we're going to go visit a web page, this is just a web address is a URI. Let's set up, and again, we're going to do an action view. So action view is a common one that's set up here. Now, some intents are going to need some extra data, so like storing a calendar activity here or sending an email address is going to require additional information. So we create our intent, and then we use this put extra to store some extra information. There's a set of different types of extra information we can put in there. So like with an email, you can add a subject line and the text of the email. You can add the recipients as an array of strings. We'll be using this calendar intent here. So we'll create our calendar intent, and then we'll set up the date, both the beginning time and end time, and then we'll put those in here in our intent. We can also add the title and the location of our calendar event. Now, before we actually start the intent, um, Android's been stressing this, that you should verify that there's an activity, I mean an app out there that can process your intent. Generally, there is for most of these. There should be a default calendar, default email, default camera, default map activity, default phone activity. But it is also common for some devices to be restricted. So if this is a work device, the camera might be restricted, or the telephone might be restricted and not available to all users. Also, if there are parental controls in place, you might not be able to access these. So this is a good process. We use the package manager, we get a package manager, and then we ask the package manager, here's the intent, how many apps out there can handle that intent. So we get a list of apps that can handle that intent, and then we're just going to check if that array, that list is has at least one element in it, and if so, then we can start the activity. To start activity, we just use the start activity with the intent we created. So here's the whole thing. Like here's where we're going to set up a map intent. We create the URL. We define the intent using that URI. We then verify, once we have that intent set up, that there, with that map intent, that there we get the list of apps out there that can process that, and we make sure that there's at least one app that can do maps. And once we know that, then we start the activity. So I often combine this step and this step together rather than creating this boolean, so we'll look at a way of shortening that a little bit. So now when you actually run this, I have a couple camera apps on my phone, might have multiple apps for maps. So sometimes, and well, you don't have to worry about this, but the Android will sometimes display a list of options like, do you want to process this app with, or this intent with this app or with this app? And we're not going to worry about that. We're going to have that taken care of for us by the Android system. If you want to do an app and get a response back, and we won't be doing that in the first activity here, but there's another call. Rather than just saying start activity, there's start activity for result. So you call that, and then you have to have a separate method called on activity result. And the on activity result is called when the other app is done and sends a request back, and they provide you some data back from that. This is often used like if you want to have the camera activity go take a photo, and you of course then want to process the photo and do something with the photo or something like that. Now, if you're going to want your app to provide certain services, you have to add what's called an intent filter. We are not going to go over this, but if at some point you're developing an app and you want it to be able to process camera actions or other things from other apps, you would have to set this up. So that's the basic tutorial that's here. There's also another walkthrough here on intents and intent filters that's from the Android system. Talks about, here's our activity. We do start activity. That goes through the Android system to the other activity through these intent systems, and talks a little bit about this. But again, I don't think you need to go over this level of detail here too much. The other link here is useful. This common intents lists most of the common intents that are out there. So these are all a bunch of the common intents: setting an alarm clock, email, maps, playing music, doing search, phone, text messaging, web browsing, all that stuff. So, and then for all of these, there will be sample intents that are set up for this. Now, another thing that we may want to look at is that we may have to set up permissions in a file for using these intents. Often in your app, you then specify what permissions your app needs. This is done so that when the user downloads your app, it asks, do you need, this app requires these permissions and you have to approve those before installing this app. So there are certain permissions that are put in place for this app. Um, and this is in the manifest file. So we'll look at that once we get our sample project set up in our activities. So that's the basics of setting up intents and working with intents. We'll be doing an activity here and then an assignment related to those.